Egypt's divided its history into, oh yeah, I want to say about dynasties. The length of the average dynasty was only about 3 generations. This has been true throughout all of history, by the way. Oftentimes a father would build up a big empire and his son could not follow his footsteps. In the case of Hammurabi's empire, it lasted to the point of his great-grandson leave. Nebuchadnezzar's empire only lasted to his son and grandson. These men would build up an empire and turn over to their son, and oftentimes their son just wasn't. And my dad and I have seen this with people who, big industrialists, who build up a giant conglomeration of a big industry. They can't turn it over to their sons because their sons won't be able to manage it. And they oftentimes turn it over to corporations, to corporate executives or something, because their sons just simply cannot handle the workload. But anyway, you had your old kingdom, your middle kingdom, and then your late kingdom. Now between these old would be intermediate periods. First intermediate period and second intermediate period. These intermediate periods like of chaos, and if you study Chinese history, they had the same thing. They would have periods where there was no strong ruler, and they had periods of chaos. Old, middle, and new, with intermediate periods in between. The Old Kingdom, again, this may have been the best kingdom. The Old Kingdom supposedly united the two Egypts. You had Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now, don't get confused. Upper Egypt was actually the south. Lower Egypt, they didn't think of north as being higher. Like all of our maps, we point north. I mean, we are pointed north, and we think of north. Hey, I'm from up north, or I'm from down south. Why do they call lower north? Because the southern part of Egypt was on a higher elevation than the part near the coastline. You know, they knew that the Nile was flowing along and then would drop off. So Upper Egypt was higher in altitude, higher in altitude. Lower Egypt was closer to sea level. But anyway, at one time it appears that there were two Egypts, an upper and a lower, and then along came a great Egyptian pharaoh, and he united the two Egypts. Do you have one?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyway, he united the two Egypts into upper and lower, into one kingdom. Now, the Egyptian ruler had the title of Pharaoh. And I've heard that word pronounced many different ways, but well, I'll call him Pharaoh because I think that's the one I've heard the most. Pharaoh lived in a separate house. Like the word Pharaoh means house. He lived in a separate house. He was oftentimes looked back. He was looked on as being a god. Some of the more famous pharaohs, the first one I want to mention is Hatshepsut, the queen. We have found what we know about Hatshepsut from trash piles, because when her son took over, he tried to obliterate all her memory and threw her statues into the trash can. But in the land of Egypt, being so dry, things are preserved. So her statues seem to show a remarkably attractive woman, and what was written about her seems to indicate that she must have been an intelligent woman, but she was not liked, again, because she was a woman. Some women in those days were able to take the throne, and here's how they would do it. And this was true in China, Egypt, and a whole lot of places. They were the wife of the king. When their husband would die, he would sometimes leave a young son who was too young for the throne, maybe a preschooler or an 8, 9, 10-year-old boy. So the mother would take over as regent while the boy grew up, but much too often she would find a way to poison or shove the young boy aside and say, from now on, I'm the sole ruler, and take over and run the country. And Hatshepsut might have gotten power the same way. Or she might have been like in a case where that she was an only child. She was a daughter And when her father died, she managed to finagle around and usurp the throne by promising this person this and that. All right. Another the most famous Pharaoh of all time is a Pharaoh named King Tut. King Tut came in. The reason he's famous is not for anything he did was great. He only lived 21 years and was only Pharaoh for a short time. But apparently he was extremely wealthy, and he might have been extremely sickly also, what we know about, from what we see about his remains. And he might have died a very violent, horrible death. But anyway, his mummy was found amidst a whole lot of wealth. It had been overlooked because apparently he did it very well. His mummy was found, and his body has been carried all over the globe, and spent some time here in Atlanta a few years back, at the Atlanta Civic Center. No, I did not go see it. But King Tut. Now, another famous Pharaoh is King Akhenaton. That name is in the book, and I'm not sure. Essentially, the reason you remember him was King Akhenaton. He tried to turn Egypt back to monotheism. And right in that moment, I can't think of I can't find the page where he's on. But anyway, he tried to set up a monotheistic system in Egypt. He failed. And after he died, they again tried to obliterate his name and make people forget, and they returned to the worship of all the old gods. The Egyptian gods, they tend to have an animal head and a human body. Particularly, they seem to be fond of the cat. The ancient Egyptians really liked cats. And some of their gods had a cat head, domestic house cat like. They also had a falcon god, a god with a falcon head, a god with a lion head. They seem to have liked gods that were part animal and part human. Now, again, a big problem we have with ancient Egyptian history is lining up their dynasties. Some scholars today believe that they took dynasties that actually ruled simultaneously and tried to put them end to end, and to try to make Egyptian history a lot longer than it really was, and it needs to be shortened. I mean, hey, my graduate professor said, now, scholars, they keep pushing these events back, like they could just take them, but in recent times, they've had to bring them forward again. Again, the reason they wanted to make them look older was to try to prove that the earth was older than, they were trying to disprove the Bible, just plain it, and trying to prove that the earth was older than the Bible said it was. But in recent times, they've been forced to rethink, and a lot of these dynasties they wanted to push way, way back into the thousands of years. They've had to bring forward because it appears that some of these dynasties were contemporary, and Egypt was not always united, but was in fact divided for many, many generations longer than ancient scholars are ready to admit. So when you talk about Egyptian history, and you come to a point where Abraham visited Pharaoh, the question comes up, who was the Pharaoh Abraham visited? And I've read works by at least 4 modern scholars. They all come up with 4 different pharaohs. Who was the Pharaoh Isaac visited? Who is the Pharaoh who made Joseph Grand Vizier? I have a pretty good opinion on that. For Pharaoh Sesostris, because Pharaoh Sesostris had a servant whom he depended on heavily. Now, the next question, who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And folks, there are about 8 or 10 different pharaohs who get that candidate. They once thought it was Amenhotep II, but now, recent scholarship, they don't think so. And again, it's all difficult to determine owing to the fact that the Egyptians are known to have deliberately twisted and contorted their history to the point where it's almost unrecognizable. However, as we go farther into it and start digging up the old tombs and reading the original inscriptions that were left alone by later scholars, they're burial, particularly because they're very deep inside the tombs, we can begin to say, well, this Pharaoh ruled this many years, but he was contemporary with this Pharaoh who ruled this many. We might be able eventually to reconstruct an accurate chronology of Egyptian history and determine who these pharaohs were, who did this and who did that. All right. Eventually, as was the case of all these countries, the land of Egypt declined, died out. Now, it didn't die. Egypt still exists to this day, but it declined and eventually became somewhat of a second-rate kingdom. All right, we're going to move on. Now, folk, you and I both know I have left out. Yes?
When did Egypt become a Muslim state?
You're talking about 700 CE. In other words, we're ending our story about 600 BCE, some 1,300 years after this. Okay, essentially what happened, Egypt ceased to be a major kingdom, and then they fell to Alexander, well, actually backing up a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar conquered them, Babylon, in 600 BCE. Then in 300 or so BCE, Alexander the Great conquered them. Actually, after Nebuchadnezzar, Cambyses conquered them, the Persians. So they were conquered by Babylon, then they were conquered by Persia, then they were conquered by Alexander, then they were independent for a while, then they were conquered by Rome, then they became part of the Byzantine Empire, then they became independent of them, and then the Arabs poured out of Arabia about 700 CE, 700 years in the Common Era. So you're talking about from the time period we're ending 1,300 years before Egypt was conquered by the Muslims.